I believe that transformation led both from the top down in terms of aspiration, but really from the ground up in terms of execution, is more likely to result in the kind of shift that organizations need to make in these disruptive times. This is not simply, I believe, anymore about moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. This is probably about finding an entirely different ship.
Caroline, could you tell us whether you think transformation is more of a process that has to be top down, or whether a bottom up approach tends to work better in your experience?
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to join the panel today. I think this is a really good question, especially considering some of the changes that we've seen around workforce dynamics and the kind of opportunity that particularly our younger employees have, frankly, to vote with their feet and to be much clearer about what they want from a working experience. So we've worked in the R² factory over the last 5 years, initially on the digital transformation of Rolls-Royce. And that's an initiative which was definitely led from the top down. So that was part of the strategic agenda of our CEO, Warren East. It's very clear when he joined the organization that there were 2 strategic challenges that he wanted the group to meet. One was leading in the energy transition towards a net zero economy. And the second was helping Rolls-Royce to become a data-first business. But in achieving the second of those, that data-led transformation, it really was something that had to be achieved with that support from leadership, but in an organic and bottom-up way. And the reason that that's true is because when you think about how data analytics and particularly machine learning transform organizations' ability to respond to change, the manifestation of that comes through human beings. It doesn't come through technology. The technology is important, but unless the human beings are incorporating it into their working practices and feeling comfortable and confident that their skills are putting them in a place to be successful in the future, then really that transformation is very unlikely to stick. And so we worked very hard across the organization to deliver what we described as an evolutionary species level shift, really challenging the organization right at the level of its DNA to be able to respond to the increasing demands for agility, the increasing demands for flexibility, the increasing demands for inventiveness and boldness. And thank goodness we did, because actually what we couldn't have known at the start of that process was the impact that things like the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine war have had on some of those ways in which Rolls-Royce has had to operate.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really interesting food for thought to get the conversation up and running. I mean, you mentioned there the importance of, really making a change in the cultural DNA of the company. I mean, what sort of advantages do you think that's given you in your experience? I mean, where did you see that really pay dividends, there being a cultural shift, not just a kind of messaging from the top, but the fact that you kind of brought people along with you?
I think it really has to be seen in ownership. Is my answer. When you engage across an organization in that organic way, and forgive the analogy, which is, which is a very uncomfortable one, but really this is like a virus, right? This is like the process by which you see that rapid population of a virus across a population, because really what we're looking for is the T cells, the change agents, the people within the organization who can invest themselves in that transformation, who can influence their peers, who are trusted, who are not from some nameless group of consultants who might be brought in to give you the spreadsheets and the argumentation, who are not part of a kind of bureaucratic management team who may have been through this several times before. These are peers of the individuals for whom that transformation is a reality, and that's really, really important. It's about having that ownership and that investment at that peer level, and that creates the kind of momentum and the kind of groundswell that can actually have transformations really work. There are downsides to it, of course. Your transformation is going to be more organic. Things will come out of it that you were not expecting. Hopefully most of those will be really positive, but it will have less rigidity of control. It will be less spreadsheet driven, it may not perfectly match all of the aspirations that you had on timeframes or some of the success factors that you may have imagined at the beginning. But genuinely, I believe that transformation led both from the top down in terms of aspiration, but really from the ground up in terms of execution, is more likely to result in the kind of shift that organizations need to make in these disruptive times. This is not simply, I believe, anymore about moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. This is probably about finding an entirely different ship.
Sure. Umang, I'd like to bring you in now. I saw you nodding your head furiously at some of those opening remarks there. I mean, would that characterize the sort of what you've seen during your experience as well with CIPLA? Has it been necessary to really shift the culture, not just kind of offer diktats from the top?
Yeah, I think that some of the points made were really good. And thank you for sharing. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to start with, maybe a little bit of rallying people along, whether it comes bottom up or it goes top down. I think the first thing is it's got a link to your purpose. So at CIPLA, for example, I wished that we can say transformation ends. It's just been going on and on, right? Every year there's something new that needs to transform in each one of our companies. But the first thing that, we keep asking ourselves every time we want to do something different is, what do we mean to the world? Why do we exist, right? And I think somewhere you've got to, communicate back with the people, back with your organization around why we exist and why what we're about to do is going to be fundamental to that existence. And I think so we see a lot of linkage to purpose. We see a lot of linkage to values. Transformations are difficult times. People have to learn how to make decisions differently. They have to learn to look at new resources, right? I think the speaker before me said, analytics, you've got to get people to get used to that. And I think the only way you can do that is by protecting your soul. So promote your values, promote your purpose, right? And that's for us is very often the starting point. I think, where I've noticed, at least at CIPLA, we went through an exercise where we tried to define through the transformation, what was our credo? Why do we come to work every day? And what are those values that we hold dear, irrespective of the disruptions in the world, right? And if we protect the soul, we're going to get a lot out of it, right? Because you never lose your soul. I think the other thing that I would add, which is important, is the role of leaders is also to make sure that you make it simpler for your organization to execute your priorities. Many times in transformations, what we lose sight of is the stakeholder hierarchy changing in the company. Right? So when you go through the soul-searching philosophy, you come to the conclusion, who is the most important stakeholder for you? Is it your shareholder? Is it your customer? Is it your patient? And it's easy to tell the organization everyone's important, right? But you've got to fundamentally break down the first 2 or 3 years of your transformation, who is the most important stakeholder for you? And therefore, that's how people learn how to make decisions. I could see our people making different decisions if we were to go back and say, no, it's not the patient and it's not the customer who's most important, but the shareholder. It would have resulted in very different decisions and very different outcomes for us. And I think the other thing that I would just say is be objective. This is a journey, and the year 2 or year 3 of transformations is often the worst. The consultants give a very nice name to it called the valley of despair. That's when your reality starts hitting you in terms of the expected pace of a transformation and where you are really with respect to your own journey. So I think you have to keep that inspiration quotient out. There's, I keep telling our teams, we keep doing, we started something called reflections. Because as you're going through a transformation journey, it's so easy for people to get demotivated, get off your bus. But, when you reflect together as a team, you get to know about we get to know about how the organization is feeling. So we have a reflections platform, and what's most important there is dialogue. And it also offers you an ability to get new ideas from within your team. So I think that's those are some of the learnings that we've had at CIPLA and some of the things that we've been able to do. I completely agree with Carol's point. I think the issue around getting the right set of capabilities is important. Many times in transformation, we try to retrofit people. 60%, 70% of the time that works. 30% of the time, you need to have new capabilities. brought into the organization. And the sooner you do it, I think the better it is for the success of the transformation. So those would be some of the thoughts that come top of my mind, actually.
Sure. I mean, you noticed there that, people, kind of allude to, both of you have alluded to the issue that, this process can reveal some things about who within the organization is a peer, who's respected, who's trusted. I mean, what's the other side of the coin, though, when you've had people who've maybe been successful under the kind of like before the change, who find themselves, may have a lot to recommend them, but feel a little bit maybe disenfranchised, maybe discombobulated by seeing change. I mean, how do you kind of like handle that to the people who are a bit reluctant to get on board?
Yeah, and it's my experience that the people who are older with the organization, they're the people who are actually the rich pools of culture lives in, right? They're the people who are most connected to your purpose, right? And ideally, while we would say that these are people who are not sitting with the new paradigm, you need an active balance, because these are the people who've got the company where it is. For example, we're an 85-year-old organization, right? When we started our transformation, we were almost 75 years old, right? And our culture and our purpose lived through the people who've been with us. So I think it's not an easy thing. You have to dialogue most with them. I think about what their role is going forward. And, and I always tell our teams that there are those solid citizens and those people who've been loyal to the company have to be a part of the overall transformation journey. So the more you decide that they're part of your bus, I think you've got to decide this relatively early. Who among them are going to be your co-participants in your journey, your co-authors, and bring them in and make enough attempt to bring them onto your bus and give them a firm seat at the bus. But there will be those people who are just not going to be able to transform with you, and at that point in time, and they know it. And I think the issue is at times they can be cynical, and managing that in a transformation is equally important as much as bringing new people in is.
So I think there's, from both yourself and from Caroline, we've got really a sense of, it's about, a big part of this is about balance, really. Paul, I want to turn to you now. I mean, when you joined Smith's Group, it maybe wasn't, its performance wasn't perhaps as stellar as parties might have liked it to be. So, you were someone who had to kind of come in and, persuade people to, come, really sign up to your agenda and, make some quite fundamental changes in how the business is run. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, Claire, thanks for the question, and thanks to the FT for organizing this fantastic event. I think Carolyn and Umang have hit on many of the central points here. Maybe what I would add to it is reflect on the African proverb that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And in the case of Cipla or Rolls-Royce or Smiths, these are very good companies that have been around for a long time. In our case, 171 years. And so these are organizations that know how to be successful, but as time moves forward, somehow they forget elements of that. So a lot of my job over the last 18 months has just simply been helping the organization remember what they did right before. And so most of my time is around people and culture. It is fostering an environment where people don't just feel empowered, but feel obligated to raise their hand, to contribute. And then the flip side of that is they have a similar responsibility to deliver against that short list of priorities that we all selected together. And I think when you keep people focused on what is right rather than who is right, you find that magic. And it's as simple and it's as hard as that.
And can you maybe give us like a few concrete examples of where you've kind of like instilled that? I mean, that sense of, I think it's interesting that, a lot of you have drawn on this institutional memory. I mean, how have you really specifically been able to convey that to the people who are maybe feeling a bit, not great about their working environment?
Yeah, transformation, of course, is a big word, and it gets used in a lot of different cases. You know, it's like empowerment or innovation or partnership. And I think the first step is knowing what type of transformation you're really looking for. Are you trying to fundamentally change your organization, or are you trying to just change its performance? There are cases that companies have created a lot of value by fundamentally changing their DNA. You know, Danaher is a good example. It was a tools company, then it became a diversified industrial. Today, it's a life sciences company, fundamentally different, and has created value along the way. In our case, that wasn't what we were trying to do. This is a very good company, as you said, that just hadn't performed in line with its potential. So a lot of what we've done was just refining what we have down to the central essence that we know works. We sold off our largest business. It was a medical business that didn't fit with our industrial core. It was dilutive strategically, it was dilutive financially, and it absorbed a lot of energy that we could have had a higher return focused on what we do best. We made some changes to our management team. We were very intentional about balancing the new additions to our executive committee between promoting the really strong talent we have in our company and then supplementing that with a few new skills and experiences from outside the company. And then, of course, all that has to come together with performance. Success begets success. And if you get points early on the board, that goes a long ways to getting all your stakeholders to believe. And we've had some luck in that regard. So it's coming together nicely.
Sure. I mean, this time issue, I think, is something that we really want to maybe come back to later on in the session, that, the most fruitful changes in the long term may not be possible to achieve over a short period of time, as you put it with you alluded to the nice proverb earlier. And I want to bring Errol in now. I mean, you've been working with a lot of businesses. We've seen three here of really, all of the panelists have highlighted the importance, I think, of bringing people along and culture. What has been your sense from over the course of your career talking to many firms? I mean, when companies get transformation right, is it always about adapting the people and the culture, or what would your kind of top 3, top 5 lessons be?
Well, thank you, Claire. It's great to be with the panel here, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on. I mean, what I do, and I guess this is the challenge of going last, is what else can you say? I think the others have covered this really nicely here. So what I'd maybe highlight is, from my experience, obviously working with a number of organizations in terms of driving this change, you kind of get to a point of, why do transformations not work? So I think we've known historically a number of research and studies that have been done have demonstrated that a lot of transformations fail. So we actually kicked off some research recently with Oxford University's Saïd Business School to actually explore, to the point that Caroline was making earlier, some of the human dimension of this. Because as much as we're now in an era of technology, fundamentally it's actually about the people. And so we interviewed both leaders, those that had sponsored as well as driven transformational change, but we also spoke to the workers, if you like. So the people actually have to do the work and make that change happen. And we got some really interesting insights that ultimately said, so outside of all the things you would expect to see in relation to a transformation in terms of planning it, getting it right in terms of clarity of vision and all of those aspects, that fundamentally there's some really human-based and emotional-based aspects that are critically important in terms of getting it right. So if I maybe just summarize those quickly. So in the first instance, it's about the leader, of course, and all three, I think, have spoken to the importance of the attributes of the leader in this. And that's oftentimes technical skills, vision skills. We heard about purpose and making sure that we're aligned to those things. All of those things are absolutely true. But I think empathy becomes a really important aspect of this, and making sure that the leader understands that the people that need to go through this, the scale of change that they're being asked to, understands it's not a routine assignment for them, and feels a degree of empathy towards the journey that they go on, and demonstrate in their own way that they will support that in terms of going forward. So that's really important in terms of what an organization does. And if you think about that in terms of creating a culture, it's then about, and we've all been on programs where people are encouraged not to speak up when things aren't working. And generally you find that those, and we saw this from the research, is where it fails. Because what's happening with culturally within an organization then is that the workers, the people that are working on the ground 2 or 3 levels down in the organization, don't feel empowered to say when something isn't working. And the reality is in most programs when that happens, it becomes a bigger problem over time and then actually derails everything. And so if you give people the psychological safety to raise issues and actually talk openly with colleagues about how to address them, that also can help empower those individuals to make the change happen for the organization. So that's really important as well in terms of how we look at this. And then what I'd also say is the next element is making sure that you are now embracing technology to connect to influencers, if you like, within your organization that will fundamentally make the difference. So a lot of organizations look at their structures when it comes to making change, but oftentimes, just as it is, you can imagine in the wider social world now, there are people within any organization who will disproportionately influence the behavior within that. And so making sure that you can get those people on side and acting as advocates for the change will be critically important. But what I'd say net, and the research is out there, is it's just considering and contemplating that human dimension, making sure that you understand and realize that transformation is difficult and it's taking people on a journey that they are uncomfortable with. And if you don't give them a platform and environment to make them feel safe in doing so and be empathetic in terms of how you approach that, you won't get the buy-in, you won't get the support. It doesn't matter how great the technology is, it doesn't matter how fantastic the vision is, you will not see the change and the success that you need.
And I imagine when you start these discussions with companies, a lot of the time you're going to be speaking to the senior management, the leader. I mean, has it been your impression that leaders are in general, too quick to want transformation, or do they tend to be the laggards? How does it work in terms of like how the people at the top think? Are they, they're usually pro or anti-change?
Well, I think I think leaders have to be pro change, and I not just visibly pro, if you like, but people need to see that in the substance of how they act, in their in the way that they behave. I think that's a fundamental requirement in terms of change being successful. But I think what's interesting, of course, is that leaders, and forgive me for saying this because maybe I can, because I feel like I'm getting old myself, is that they are of a generation generally who are used to the success of what worked yesterday, if you like, and not necessarily what will work tomorrow. And that's, again, another important lesson to actually take yourself out of your leadership role and see what people within your organization are doing to enable your customers to have a better experience, or to drive efficiencies in your supply chain, or whatever that may be, to understand what the impact of technology could be having to make that better. And if you don't embrace that, it becomes very difficult to imagine what the people within your organization are going through. So I think being prepared to challenge yourself to jump out of your comfort zone as a leader and demonstrate the behaviors and the change that you want to see in your team, I think that's critically important.
Thanks for that, Errol. Some very, very pertinent lessons there, very nicely summarized. We're living through a period of radical change. I mean, if you look at the geopolitical and macroeconomic environment right now. In addition to the pandemic, we've got the war in Ukraine. We've got, after more than a decade of low interest rates, the cost of borrowing around the world has shot up quite sharply this year. We've seen the revival of inflation in a lot of parts of the world. I mean, how do you think these factors are really impacting change?
Well, if I kick off with that, I mean, my sense is, you've summarized it really well. I think in many ways it feels a little bit unprecedented to have all of these things happening simultaneously. So what I'd add maybe to your narrative is part of the consequence of those things is that we're probably seeing the end of the era of globalization. So we're moving into a multipolar world, and that will impact supply chains. It'll impact access to labor and capital, which will therefore impact the cost that organizations are carrying and the complexity that they need to navigate, assuming they work internationally. And so I think we're with the kind of economics that you've described, we're in an era that people need to respond to, transitioning to being digital organizations, transitioning to drive sustainability in everything that they do, and lots of other aspects that we're driving transformation, but they'll need to get more for less. And part of the danger, obviously, of that is that people will cut budgets, people will not redress their ambition, but they'll maybe cut corners in terms of some of the things we've all talked about earlier in terms of what makes transformation successful. So I think it's about getting very smart with the portfolio to see how can you join initiatives up to get a double whammy, if you like, to make sure that if you are investing and changing from a digital transformation perspective, then what can you do differently to drive your agenda around sustainability or different aspects? So joining the dots between certain things that you're doing, so the organization feels like it's only doing some things once, will help on the cost issues of doing that, and still help, obviously, for the organizations to move forward. But we're certainly moving into an era of complexity for organizations to navigate and make the choices that they need to make.
I mean, some very interesting comments there. I mean, I'd like to just come back to one. I mean, you mentioned the shift to the multipolar world, that we might be seeing the end of globalization as we knew it in the past few decades. I mean, I'd like to bring the other panelists in. Would you share that view that we are moving to more closed systems, or has your experience been the opposite of that?
I mean, Claire, maybe I'll jump in. I certainly agree with that perspective, but I think I would put it in a broader context. And, now maybe I'm dating myself. I graduated from uni in the early 90s, and that was the first US recession since the Carter administration. And, of course, everyone thought that was the end of America and, the rise of the Asian tigers. And things got better and better. And then 10 years later, we had the halcyon days of the internet up until the dot-com bubble burst and that NASDAQ dropped 50% in almost overnight. But of course, we survived that and things got better and better. And almost exactly 10 years after that, we had the global financial crisis. The sky was falling until, believe it or not, we lived through that and had one of the most sustained periods of capital markets performance up until 10 years later, we had COVID. So for sure, we are in a period right now of rapid change. But history has shown time and again that the only constant is change. I had this boss before who had a great phrase he would use. He would say, if you go out into the forest and your map doesn't match the path, chances are that the forest is right. Or put more simply, the best way to navigate change is to change. So yes, we're in a period of change right now. We're going to make it through. Those high-performing organizations that respond to that will do better, but there'll be another one, if history is correct, another 10 years down the road, seems to be the economic cycle.
But just in terms of particularly of the geopolitics, are you now looking at markets that you maybe would have, made a decision on based on an economic rationale, and you're now thinking, oh, well, the politics, is political risk more of a factor for you now than say it was a couple of years ago?
Yes, I mean, of course, there's some obvious examples of markets that were highly prioritized 10 years ago. Had the BRIC countries, the R of which was Russia, which now is, there's no economic opportunity there. But again, I would say for those of us who've been at this long enough, the same thing has happened with Latin America. The B, Brazil, we all invested heavily in Latin America, and then we had the debt crisis of Latin America, which caused us all to rethink. We've all made significant investments in China. Of course, people are questioning reasonably right now what the geopolitical trade-offs of that are. I go back to change is a constant. You have to stay nimble, stay connected to what your customers want, and what works today is not going to work tomorrow. Just be ready for that, and expect the change and respond to it. That's how cycles work.
So I'd just like to emphasize now to the audience, and we've had a few questions already, but just to please keep them coming. We'll turn to them shortly. Caroline, Umang, is there anything that you'd like to add on some of the somewhat provocative comments, I think, there?
Well, I think I'd like to just make one observation, which we face into with our customers all of the time. And that's notwithstanding the comments that the other panelists have made about perhaps the narrowing of thinking of businesses in this kind of, I'm not sure it's quite post-globalization, but that's the inference. Alongside that dynamic, there's another really challenging dynamic, which is that most of the big problems that industrial organizations that we work with face into today are system-wide problems. And by which I mean they exist outside the boundaries of a single organization. They are problems associated with, for example, how do we move to more sustainable activities across the production of our goods and services. They are problems about how do we manage across an entire value chain the resilience and flexibility and responsiveness of being able to source the things we need from our supply chains to make the goods and services that we put out there. They are system-wide problems about understanding shifts in market demand. And the complexity that generates is that system-wide problems need system-wide answers. You actually can't optimize the answers to those problems unless you collaborate across that value chain. So whilst I acknowledge that there's a direction of travel here, which is about, perhaps narrowing the scope of the parts of the economic world that the businesses are deploying their activities into, simultaneously, there is a dynamic driving them towards greater and greater collaboration. And it will have to be in balancing those two trends that organizations who are going to be successful find that success. Because if they solve only for their own narrow problems in their own narrow context, they will find themselves unable to effect the kind of utility from that transformation work to actually generate the change that they need.
I might just add, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to bring you in then, so perfect timing, please.
Yeah, I'm just going to add, I think I don't know if I'd call globalization as ending. I think what we're seeing is more distributed consumption. Historically, we've lived in a world where goods move from the east to the west and the consumption centers to the west. And I think we're at a point now where if you look at the world rankings in terms of economies, I think the Asian economies are now, obviously becoming bigger centers of consumption. So I think that's one. Second, I think the way these markets are structured, what worked for how the US and Europe operated in terms of industry being largely confined to one area is not going to happen, right? So you will have manufacturing, you will have services moving closer to the markets of consumption. I don't see this as the end of globalization, right? I think aircraft demand is not going to go down for the world. It might go down in the US and Europe, but it'll definitely increase in India. The patients in the world will not necessarily increase to the same extent in the US, but they will increase in parts of India just because affordability, diagnosis, and treatment increases. So I think it's still going to be the same technology, right? That is there, which will spread globally, except the way that it spreads is different. I think I'm looking at this whole period as one of high energy. And let me explain that. I think what a wonderful time to redefine our businesses. We've historically been a company that treats patients, that was concentrated on illness. Here comes a time where we can really ask our question, what is that illness to wellness journey, right? How can we be a part of wellness? And that, that allows us to be a lot more digital than we've historically been. This is a time when a lot of us are asking the question, what is different versus what is adjacent, right? Because now digital offers you the opportunities to be a lot more, to get into a lot more adjacent areas than ever before. This is a time where we redefine what is the meaning of care, right? For example, we've been a manufacturer of pills. Are we only going to stay a pills manufacturer, or are we going to be in the business of care, right? And I think there are these fundamental questions which are, with digital helping you. But this is a period of high energy. I see this as a time where I think the people who will win this journey will be people who will be willing to ask these fundamental questions about how they can use some of this to further their progress. So I think we look at it more, and maybe because of the fact that this company is more on the emerging side of the world, we look at it with a lot of optimism about what this environment could bring in the future. Not just because the consumption bases happen to be where we live, but also because fundamentally digital is just so fascinating or is a big enabler of how some of these industries could evolve.
And I'd like to just bring in one of the questions we've had from the audience there, just on the subject of digital, because I think this is quite a lot of people's concern with it is, how would you promote so the question is how would you promote inclusivity when you're going through transformation? How easy is it to keep older or less technically savvy people on board? So when you're talking about digitalization, but you also want to keep that institutional memory, like, how do you do it? Do you reskill people? Do you, tell me.
I'm happy to go first. I cite this example in the organization every time, right? And I always say this today, if you reach a point in an organization when it's easier for people to do something in their personal lives than it is in the organization, you're doing something wrong, right? And I give this example of travel tickets, right? It's so easy for each of us to go to a platform, book a ticket, but the same thing that you do through the organization is a huge exercise, right? It has to go to a travel desk and everything else. I also step back and say some of the best transformations in the world actually don't belong to our generation. They belong, at least in my world, to my parents' generation. They've seen the television. They've seen, they started with the radios. They went to the television. They went to the smartphones. They went to the desktops. Imagine the transformation that they've gone through. So I don't think age or older is necessary. I've seen some of the biggest adopters of technology as people who've been longest with you, but have the affinity to pick up, the curiosity. So I think what we look for in people is not whether they're old or young, it's really whether they are curious enough to pick up the new way of working. And I think that's the big sell. If you think that there are people who are curious in your organization, I think that goes a long way.
Okay.
Yeah, I like what Umang said. For global companies like the three on the panel that we have, who succeed over the time spans that we have, over time, you can only prosper if your customers and your communities do. And the only way you can do that is by having a employee population and a management understanding of those communities. So you have to match both demographically, but also in terms of how you think, the communities in which you operate. And so parts of the world are getting older. So you absolutely need to have that perspective. Different parts of the world are getting younger. So you need to have that perspective. And the same happens in terms of other social and demographic trends. you need to match the people that you're trying to support. You need to understand how they think. And so that means you need to have that voice represented in your leadership.
And Caroline, would you like to add anything on this topic?
Yeah, I think just speaking very pragmatically, there are a couple of things that I think are really important to recognize. The first is that transformation, digital transformation, is as much as anything about mindset change. So that for me is something that comes from understanding people and from understanding what drives people, and understanding that sometimes this is as much about fear, fear of exposing your lack of skills, fear of being made to look foolish, as it is about anything else. So when you're helping people to go through that process, you need to make it a safe space. And you know, colleagues on the panel have already mentioned psychological safety. Errol talked about it in his introduction as being critically important. One of the ways that you make transformation safe is by making elements of it fun. So if you look at, we operate a table of elements for digital transformation. Literally, it looks like periodic table, right? And it's all of the skills and capabilities and behavioral indicators that we believe you need to be able to deliver successful transformation. More than 50% of that table of elements is cultural. Only 25% of it is actually technical skills, as in, you know, coding skills or digital programming skills, or even understanding, you know, infrastructure or telecommunications. And that's really important. That 55% of that activity, which is about culture, is driven on a model which is fun first. Now, that might sound a bit frivolous in the context of massive organizations, but it's incredibly powerful and incredibly important, because if you can give somebody an experience which is positive and safe and fun, then you can help to break down some of those boundaries, some of those barriers that those individuals may have, many of which are driven from a sense of fear that their skill sets for some reason have become outdated, or that they will expose themselves as being, you know, not suitable for talent roles in this new organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think overcoming that fear has got to be a key part of it. I mean, just to kind of shift a little bit back to what we were talking about earlier, one of the people who's posed a question in the audience has mentioned the 3 C's: COVID, climate change, and conflicts. They say, what leadership traits are important for CEOs in navigating organizations in this disruptive environment characterized by these 3 C's? Errol, if we maybe start with you.
I'm assuming conflicts is a polite way of saying some of the geopolitical tension we have between countries.
I think that's the safest assumption.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think I think as the panelists have mentioned, I mean, we actually have to take comfort from history that we are very adaptable. We find ways to make things work, and we find ways to navigate the issues that we have had. I mean, just linking COVID to the previous conversation, look how all of us spun on a pin to change our business models when COVID struck. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, I certainly know our business model was severely challenged in terms of what COVID did, where we were an organization where people traditionally went out to their clients and worked on site with them. And the notion that you would sit and work at home and do something very different. And yet we've 2-3 years out of that, or through that, we've adapted, we've adopted the technology, and all of those things have worked. Similarly, you're seeing that in terms of geopolitically where we are, how fast organizations, for instance, exited Russia. Who knows how that will play out in the future, and when the opportunity goes to go back. I'm sure that will in time happen as well. And obviously there's some challenges in the way in China now that they're looking from a technology perspective to look at different platforms which give challenges in terms of organizations that want to join up across on consistent systems and ways of working and infrastructure. But all of these things, I think we underestimate our resilience, as if you like, to respond to these challenges. And I think I feel very optimistic that we have the right people and organizations to address those different forces of change. But it doesn't mean that it's easy. So I think people will adapt as appropriate. But also, we also should recognize that organizations do transition. If you look at 15 years ago, the Fortune 500 looked very different to what it is today. So that's the process of the cycle of change, that companies do change as well in that context. Some survive, some don't, but something else comes along then to fill the gap. And I think we should get comfort from that.
And what do you think? I mean, I think it's a very important point that you draw on to say, you know, the composition of the Fortune 500 leadership has shifted quite a lot. I mean, what sort of traits would this generation have that would stand them in good stead compared with, say, you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Look, I think, yeah, we're asking a lot of leaders of organizations today. I think the command and control way that I'm slightly characterizing, I'm not suggesting this is all that was the case, that historically would have been the case in many organizations. We're asking, I mentioned empathy and what we need to drive. People are now having to show much more of themselves in terms of how they show up to work, as opposed to working through traditional structures and systems. So I think we're asking a lot of them as individuals and people, and in many ways, COVID exposed a lot of people to just show themselves, put themselves out there a lot more than they would have done historically. But I think also, you'll find, and you just talked about people embracing digital transformation, you have to be curious, you have to be adaptable, you have to be ready to embrace change. And that is just the nature. I think Paul mentioned earlier that, I mean, change is a constant now. So you've just got to be of a mindset that embraces that and enjoys that, actually. And maybe to Caroline's point, finds the fun in that, because it's a given that that's there. And if you don't, then I'm not sure that you will continue for much longer. But I think then organizations corporately need to have a culture that works that way and innovate and drive change and look for new opportunities as well.
Sure. Mike, maybe turn to you.
Yes, I think the two things that are important, at least for us, as we look at the environment, the first is really the ability to contextualize ambiguity. Because, we're living in highly ambiguous strategic highly ambiguous strategic issues. We're also living with highly ambiguous supply chain issues. So I think the one skill that we are dialing up and trying to get to some, to some understanding of is who amongst our team have the ability to contextualize ambiguity, right? And who are the people who actually take ambiguity as a challenge as against a problem, right? And begin to try and solve for both of those. The other thing that we're seeing is energy. Because some of the world's problems are tireless. You think you're done with COVID and along comes a supply chain issue. You think you're done with that, along comes a war, right? So I think you need people who have the right manifestation of energy and balance, along with the ability to contextualize ambiguity. I think these are two skills that at least we think we're dialing up significantly as a precursor to leadership in our company.
I'd like to make some suggestions, and I'm a very new CEO, so I make these suggestions with a degree of great humility given the experience of the rest of the panel. But I'd say from where we're looking at this, curiosity absolutely is critical. And I think that curiosity into that ability to contextualize ambiguity, I very much agree. Curiosity into systems and how systems work. The second thing I'd say is collaboration, because I genuinely don't believe that any CEO, regardless of how well-established, old or successful their organization, is going to be able to address these problems without a great deal more collaboration than we might have seen over the last 25 years or so. And then the third quality, and this might be a little more unusual, is kindness. And I don't just mean kindness to one's employees, but I also mean kindness to oneself, because that point around energy and resilience in the management of energy is critical. And the reality is the best way to effectively manage energy levels in oneself and across one's organization is by having that ability to empathize and to have an ambition for kindness as part of the corporate toolset.
Yeah, I think a lot of you are touching on this issue of empathy, which I think probably is a significant, change, but based with kind of like our earlier generation sense of what a kind of CEO maybe look like. Paul, could I bring you in here? I mean, what would your thoughts be on this topic?
I mean, I'd start by saying I love the question. What's the solution to the 3 C's of conflict, COVID, and climate? And I love my fellow panelists' answer. I would take the 3 C's from what they said. I would take contextualize from Umang. I would take collaboration from Carolyn, and I'd take culture from Errol. Those 3 things help you navigate a lot of another C, complexity. So, we probably now have too many C's for the conversation. We'll have to switch letters, but I think my fellow panelists hit it pretty well.
Okay, very nicely put. Thank you all. So next question, we've got quite a few here. Misconceptions and myths. So how did you refute the naysayers when completing your transformations? Who would like to go first with that one?
I'll offer some thoughts. So one of the most powerful ways to help people who might start off in an opposing position come to a better approximation with you is either by showing them value, manifest value, or by showing them how you make their pain go away. I mean, really and honestly, you can go back to Wolf of Wall Street, right? Fear and greed. So either you're delivering something which is of real value, or you're delivering something which makes life easier. If you can find those things to deliver in relatively short order, with a rapid iterative approach, in a way which goal seeks for you the outcomes you want to achieve without dismissing the short-term benefits that might deliver themselves to people who would otherwise be resistant, you'd be surprised how much that resistance can be overcome. I think approaching naysayers with a my way or the highway approach is probably counterproductive. It might be possible in a very command and control driven organization, or one where there's an awful lot of bureaucratic power, but in terms of getting a transformation to actually stick, I think it's unlikely to succeed, and certainly should perhaps be kept only as a nuclear option when all else has failed.
Yeah, maybe I'll build on what Carolyn said, because I agree with her premise. Listen, organizations, people are smart. And if they are pushing back on a big change agenda, there's probably a reason for it. Big leaders feel like they have to drive big change. And there are instances, as Errol pointed out, where big transformations just weren't appropriate, and it was the wrong tool for the job. You see it time and again with massive acquisitions. That is just not what the organization needed. Massive IT implementations. Nope, that wasn't the right tool. Massive global org changes. Nope, that not the right tool. So I think smart management teams know how to balance defeating cynicism with understanding pushback. In my experience, the organization is usually right.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really valuable lesson, that it's not just about convincing the naysayers, but recognizing that they may have a point. I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time now. I'd like to thank the speakers. It's been a wonderful discussion. I feel like I've learned an awful lot about a very complex and daunting process. And I feel as though I'd like to work for all of your companies, actually. I think, really like a lot of, a lot of I think empathy was the key word of the session. So in terms of so thank you all for coming along today. Thank you in the audience for watching. This session will be available on the FT Global Boardroom website for the next 90 days. And I'd now like to pass you back to our studio anchor. Thanks a lot for joining us for this session. It's been a pleasure.